So good morning, everyone.
Morning.
How are you today? Good?
Yeah.
All right. Immer gut, manchmal besser, right? All right. So what I want to do today is talk to you about the book I've just finished that comes out this fall. It's called Love's Braided Dance, Hope in a Time of Crisis. And I want to sort of give an overview of some of the things I'm trying to accomplish in the book, and then I'm going to do a little bit of reading from it. Because it's a different kind of book for me, because it's not an academic book or scholarly book. It's one that's really driven by personal narratives and stories. And it was a tremendous amount of fun to write. And I think some of these stories, do a better job of communicating what hope actually looks like in the world. What it takes for hope to take root in a community or in a person's life. I want to tell you just a little bit about how this project even got started. And it begins with a project I did with a number of scholars from around the world who wanted to look at the Anthropocene and what it does for the way we think about basic questions. And it was a pretty amazing group. All sorts of people were involved, anthropologists, historians, natural scientists, and we had just the most amazing conversation because we agreed, we started with the assumption that many of the commitments that we've been working with to make sense of our world and our life just don't obtain anymore. Because the world is dramatically changed by the economic power that is exhibited now, every part of the globe. So there's no place from the cellular to the meteorological level that doesn't bear an imprint of human technology and power. So what does that mean for big, big questions? And for me, the big question that I wanted to think about was the question of hope. Because most people who engage the Anthropocene do not cast it in glowing terms. There are some who do, but we don't believe them. And so that was, a big part of the question for me is how do you talk about hope? And listening to young people talk about hope and say, I don't want your hope. Hope is a useless term. And so what do you do when someone says, we're not going to talk about, we're beyond hope, or we're just giving up on hope, or whatever? And these are really powerful sort of objections to the very idea of hope. But I didn't want to give up on the term because I think like terms like love or terms like God, these are root words. They're just really important and seem that maybe are indispensable. I don't know. I don't have a big stake in this, but I wanted to try to understand whether or not it's possible to still use the term and find out if it's a way of speaking about hope that will resonate with people and might actually inspire people. And this became sort of the operating assumption in the book. And I knew that if I was going to do this, it was not going to be possible to do it by just saying, hey, be hopeful. That's garbage. And one thing you know when you're with younger people is they smell bullshit a second away. And if you're bullshitting them, they are not interested. You lose them. And so in the book, it was important to spend a lot of time talking about how hard something like hope is in the world. Because if you don't start with that acknowledgement, you're not being honest. So I tried to be honest in the book. The book is called Love's Braided Dance because it's from one of Wendell's poems called In Rain. And it's an excerpt from one of the stanzas that reads, the way I go is marriage to this place, love's braided dance covering the world. And I've long loved that stanza in his poem. And it's a description, obviously, about fidelity and love, and the poem that you heard him read yesterday got at what some of that is. But I don't, for a second, deny how difficult it is to do something like that, because marriage to this place, we got some married folk in the room. It's tough, right? Early on in my marriage, my brother said to me, so have you figured out yet how easy it is to really destroy your wife? I said, Sam, I'm still in honeymoon phase here. Come on, be a little nicer. But it's the truth. It's so easy for us, for a variety of reasons, to lose fidelity, to lose our commitment to each other. So I don't take for granted that something like fidelity is an easy thing. But we have to explore what its possibilities are, what its difficulties are, so that we can try to move more beautifully into what a life of fidelity might look like. I didn't want to sort of do a theoretical analysis of the term. This is pretty boring, actually, and there are plenty of people who've done that. What I wanted to do in the book instead is describe what I characterize as the logic of hope. What makes hope happen in a world? Because I don't think it's something that we simply produce. I think hope is something that we tap into. And it's a hope that we tap into that's founded upon what I call the fundamental sacred character of this world and this life. Right? And by that, I don't mean anything really fancy. I just mean the conviction that where you are, who you are with, and who you yourself are is worthy of being cherished. Like, that's the basic concept that I'm deploying when I talk about the sacred character of life. And if you don't have that conception, I think it's really difficult to talk about hope. But what is really important about this way of talking about the logic of hope is it doesn't make it something that depends entirely upon you. All right? It's not something that you have to generate for other people. It's something that you have to learn to give yourself to as you experience it in the world. Right? So Steve, you're saying hope takes hold of you in a way. And there's something really powerful about that, and there'll be different ways that we can unpack what that means. For today, what I wanted to do, got about an hour, is talk about some of what I think are some of the key moments and moves in this logic. And it starts with something that I learned from Robin Kimmerer, who was in this group of folks that I convened. And how many of you have read Braiding Sweetgrass? Right? Who hasn't? I mean, it's an amazing book. Everybody's got it. It seems to be like being in a small village in England, and there it is in the window. I mean, it's everywhere, which is great. It's a beautiful book, and she's a beautiful human being. But one of the things that really struck me about that book, among many things that struck me, is she has this point where she says one of the real tragedies of the settlers who came to this country is they never cared to know where they were. They never invested in the land. They never cared to talk to the indigenous people and say, why does this land matter? And she said the result of that is that they could only think about their land, their places, as property, as places to conquer, as sites of extraction. Get your money, right? Perpetual quest to El Dorado. And she says what happens when that occurs is you lose the possibility of feeling the land loves you. Mm-hmm. Right? This is so important. Right? It begins with the sense that where you are is a place that makes your life possible, and when properly ordered, potentially beautiful. Right? That's an astounding thing. And it highlights something that a number of people have talked about, including Simone Weil, about the need for rootedness in our world. And by rootedness, I don't mean anything so, sort of severe as you can only be in one place and stay there all the time. No, I'm talking about people coming into the places where they live and sensing how where they are is the source of their life and their goodness. And if you don't have that sense, people feel lost and aimless. And Kimmerer says that when you don't sense that the land loves you, it's really hard to believe that you yourself are worthy of love. Because you come out of the ground. You depend upon the ground. And how do you argue for a valuable human life if everything that you depend upon is not itself valuable? And so she says we've been living with this massive psychic disturbance where we're constantly trying to compensate for the feeling deep down that we don't really matter, because this world doesn't really matter. And then we do all these sort of compensatory strategies to show how great we are. But it's all a charade. Because it's not founded upon the sense that this world is not just a place of our belonging, but a place of goodness and beauty. And so I have a chapter about the importance of belonging and how belonging sort of took root in my own existence. So I'm going to read a little bit to you from that chapter. When I was growing up on a farm in southern Alberta, I had the strong sense of where I belonged. The Rocky Mountains lined our western horizon, and a vast prairie stretched out into the east. Our sky was immense. On clear days, I relished lying down in a field and looking up at the cumulus clouds that sometimes formed overhead. On some days, the Chinook winds coming through Crow's Nest Pass were so strong that it was hard to stand up straight. When the winds calmed down, I often caught the scent of sweetgrass. Our soil was loamy and thick. Earthworms were so abundant that flocks of seagulls had a feast every time they followed our plow across the field. We expected extremes in weather, ranging from blinding blizzards in winter to intense dry heat in summer. One summer afternoon, our entire grain crop was demolished by golf ball-sized hailstones that plummeted down from a nearly black sky. I'm the youngest in a family with 4 kids that raised chickens, pigs, cattle, grew alfalfa, barley, wheat, and oats. We also tended a large garden of potatoes, carrots, peas, beans, spinach, cauliflower, peppers, onions. Almost every day was shaped by what plants, animals, and the farm itself needed. There was livestock to feed, eggs to gather, fields to plow, seed and irrigate, hay to mow, cow to milk, buildings and machinery to maintain, garden plots to weed, and crops to harvest. From an early age, I was made to understand that the world does not revolve around me. I was taught that the success of our family depended on the health and vitality of the farm, which is why farm work defined our days. All this labor amounted to much more than a job. The daily round of chores and responsibilities had the effect of placing me in our farm. The work both anchored me in this particular place, like roots that spread out in multiple directions, and nurtured me by giving me food, shelter, and a purpose. The farm provided me with an identity, an orientation, and a vocation to explore and live into. By giving me a schedule of work to do, the farm also initiated me into a way of being that helped me see life as a complex, vulnerable, and integrated reality in which creatures of all kinds depend on each other for whatever flourishing they might achieve. I did not always welcome the work. On many days, I resented it deeply. Rising before dawn throughout the summer to move irrigation pipes, putting down straw bedding for the cattle in the bitter cold of winter, seeing livestock die and having to dispose of the carcasses, removing heavy rocks from our fields, gathering and stacking an endless number of bales of hay while being attacked by mosquitoes, digging post holes by hand, being stuck on a tractor going round and round and round for hours. These are just some of the tasks that, by being annoying, frustrating, or exhausting, taught me that I didn't always want to belong. While city friends seemed to have the freedom to do with their days pretty much whatever they wanted, I was stuck within cycles of work that were unrelenting, often tedious, and regularly mocked by non-farm people. The very responsibilities that rooted me and told me where I belonged also sometimes felt like chains that confined, even humiliated me. Every fall, one of our tasks was to haul cattle manure from the corrals out into the fields. The manure fed the soil that fed the plants that fed our cattle that fed us. Every summer, you could see the line distinguishing fertilized from unfertilized land. The green of the manured field was verdant, the stalks were taller, and the heads of grain were bigger. One evening, by the light of the moon, I was hauling the last load out for the day. Our equipment was old, and I didn't realize that the conveyor belt pushing the manure to the spreaders at the back of the wagon had somehow become engaged on my drive out. The more I drove, the more compacted the cow shit became. I knew I had a problem when the wheels on the wagon driving the belt locked. I couldn't move forward or head back. I thought of abandoning the load and walking home, but that was a bad idea, because by the next day the manure would have dried and hardened into a rock. I had no choice but to use my bare hands to claw at the cow shit. After about an hour of grueling effort, much of it punctuated by every curse word I knew, I managed to clear enough shit away from the wagon wheels to be operable. I could now count on the beaters to spread the rest. No matter how much I washed, the smell lingered on my body. I stunk of cow shit for days, as if I needed another reminder that farm work could often be humiliating. I dreaded going to school. But farm work also afforded multiple pleasures. Attending the birth of a calf or a litter of piglets, breathing in the aroma of freshly cut hay, gathering eggs, shelling peas, watching grain fields turn from green to gold, listening to the munching of cattle eating fresh grass or rolled oats, seeing a well-constructed building put to good use, eating delicious food that I'd had a hand in producing. These all helped me feel that the work I did mattered and served a life-affirming end. The tedium was regularly interrupted by serendipitous encounters with a red-tailed hawk, a breathtaking sunrise or sunset, a muskrat ambling along in our marsh, the hilarious antics of piglets, the soothing smell and feel of a rain shower, the honking of Canadian geese flying above in their enormous V formations, the sighting of the occasional coyote or pronghorn antelope. These encounters reminded me of how magnificent and multifarious this world is. They put me in touch with realities that were profoundly other than me, yet were also amenable to my presence, even welcoming of it. Struggle, frustration, and inconvenience were common experiences. Nonetheless, I lived with a profound sense that my life fit here, even if the fit could be uncomfortable at times. When I worked with sufficient attention, patience, and care, the farm taught me that this world isn't a massive warehouse or stockpile of natural resources waiting to be mined and commodified. It is a gracious and generative realm, a site of hospitality that is constantly making room and provision for life to thrive. I saw plenty of pain and suffering, but I also regularly saw life's will to flower and fruit. I knew that our land and its many creatures responded generously to a loving touch, and that healing was possible despite our mistaken efforts. The land's vitality and the depth and detail of its responsivity are why our world can be a place where hope grows. Knowing that my labors were benefiting the many lives that made their home on our farm gave me a great deal of satisfaction. The work that rooted me could also make me feel, in the visceral modes of exertion and digestion, that my life, along with the lives of many other creatures, was quite literally growing out of the ground. Being in this place, I did not feel alone, abandoned, or worthless. I was stitched into a complex and dynamic fabric of being that included countless seen and unseen creatures, and that enfolded more seasons of birth, germination, growth, illness, death, and decomposition than I could comprehend. My body didn't simply move on or across the land. It was a material expression of the sacred, mysterious, and sometimes terrifying powers of life that make this world beautiful, delicious, fragrant, melodious, and good. It was an expression of the powers of life precisely because it participated intimately and practically in them. The expansiveness of being, its generosity and grace, along with its inscrutability, were regularly on display. Henry David Thoreau once suggested that we should think of our bodies as instruments through which the world sings. In a journal entry dated October 26, 1851, he said, "The instant I awoke, methought I was a musical instrument. My body was the organ and channel of melody, as a flute is of the music that is breathed through it. My flesh sounded and vibrated, still to the string, and my nerves were the chords of a lyre." But the enthusiasm of seeing himself as a listening and responding body was quickly dampened by an infinite regret to find myself not the thoroughfare of glorious and world-stirring inspirations, but a scuttle full of dirt. My regret arose from the consciousness of how little like a musical instrument my body now was. The idea of the body as a musical instrument suggests that the best life is one that attunes itself to the places we are in and to the diverse creatures we are with. The best life is a resonant life, that, like a tuning fork that responds to the vibration of another tuning fork, vibrates to the pulsing lives of others. Such a life is, as Thoreau suggested, like a flute that transforms breath into a melodious sound ranging from blues to jazz, or from a plaintive cry to an exuberant dance. The key to a symphonic and harmonious life, which I take to be a life of deep belonging and hope, is to develop the sympathy and affection that makes us want to be with others in ways that are courteous and mutually enhancing. To do so requires us to develop the improvisational skill that enables us to listen and accept, and that signals when we should stop, when we should move, and how. Much more than inclusion is at issue here, since a hopeful life depends on the knowledge that we are loved and nurtured, and that we can be a source of nurture to others too. So I then spent some more time talking a little bit about the sense of belonging and how this plays a role not just on farms. Right? This is the key thing. People keep saying, as an agrarian, you keep talking about farms. Well, farms are obviously important because we can't get away from soil. We can't get away from cultivation because they're the basic activities that make possible our eating. So farms are fundamental, but all of this can be translated into an urban neighborhood. Because you need to be rooted in neighborhoods, in urban spaces, because the neighborhoods are what nurture you. And so the roots, they may not go into literal soil, but they certainly go into school systems, they go into healthcare systems, they go into housing developments. And the question then becomes, what's feeding you? How are you being fed? Is the food you are getting from these places the sort that makes you feel more alive, that makes it possible for you to flourish? And there are experiences, I'm sure that some of you can refer to, where you have sensed that the neighborhood is a place that not just welcomes your life, but enables you to really take off and soar. And there are obviously going to be architectural elements to this. There's going to be economic elements to this. And so one of the things that I do in the book on hope is I take whole chapters talking about the importance of the kinds of economies we're going to need to create the communities in which people feel hope can grow. I have a chapter talking about architecture, because we know so much about, hey, I know you're smiling back there, Graces, about how important architecture is, because so much of our built environment is such as to make it impossible for people to feel that they are rooted, to feel that they belong, to feel the connections that at least have the potential to make them feel more alive. And I think part of the reason, maybe, I don't know for sure, but part of the reason I think Christians have not paid attention to these economic, architectural elements as central to the way they think about their mission is because we're still in the dualist hangover, which says, you know, it doesn't really matter what happens to this earth because it's all going to fry. Or it doesn't really matter what happens to our bodies because it's what our soul that matters. And the souls are they're going to go away somewhere else when we die. And this, in my view, and we can talk more about this if you'd like, this, in my view, goes directly contrary to the whole thrust of Scripture, which is to say that God creates the world as the expression of God's own love, and God is constantly then Emmanuel coming down to earth to be with creatures, to be in covenant relationship with all creatures and the land and people, for the sake of what? Shalom. Right? Or for the purposes of reconciliation. And that Christ then becomes the most poignant, embodied, practical expression of what that life looks like. When you're committed to the healing of places, the feeding of places, the reconciling of places and communities. Because when that happens, something like the glory of God is revealed in the world. Now, talking about the importance of the relationships, sensing our belonging in the world, what makes this so difficult is that we make mistakes repeatedly because we're either negligent, we're arrogant, we're afraid. Like, there's so many reasons why people cannot attend to the places where they are or be attentive to the communities in which they find themselves. And this is a tremendously complicated problem, which is why in the book I have 2 chapters dealing with the importance of forgiveness. We make mistakes all the time. Right? And if I had time, I'd love to share some poem with you by Scott Cairns, who talks about the fall. And, the fall is often presented, especially by male interpreters, as, the arrogance of man. And Cairns has this incredible description of this, in which he says, no, the fall did not happen when Adam became arrogant. The fall happened when Adam was walking with Eve through the garden, and Eve held out her hand, and he didn't take it. Right? The beauty was all around. The love was there to be held, and he didn't want it. Was he lazy? Who knows? Was he distracted? Who knows? But what's so beautiful about that is he shows how easy it is for human beings to go wayward. And in their waywardness, participate in the dissolution of the order of being that will make something like love and flourishing possible. So I want to now tell you a story that I learned in Alberta several years ago. I was up in Camrose area for a conference called the Spirit of the Land. And it was an amazing conference. It was Indigenous folks, it was farmers, and a few academics. And the question was obviously, what does reconciliation with land look like? That word wasn't always being used, but fairly frequently it was. And during one of the coffee breaks, this elderly couple came up to me and said, could we meet with you for lunch? I said, I love talking with farmers. So I said, absolutely. So he told me a story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story right now. As Don Ruzicka recalls it, the communication of forgiveness happened at roughly 6 a.m. on May 21st, 2000. It came from an unlikely, what some might consider an impossible source, a western meadowlark. Weighing in at 3 to 4 ounces and rarely longer than 10 inches, the lark isn't a big presence, but it is beautiful, with a yellow underside, a black V on its breast, and black dots striping its brown top. Don loved the sight of this bird and its watery flute-like song, but he hadn't seen or heard one in over 10 years. That morning, he was out in a pasture moving his chicken houses to fresh plots of grass when he heard a lark sing. Don stood at full attention and became completely still, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. Its second song sent him to the ground and on his knees. Its sound reverberated through his body and brought him to tears. In it, he heard the land say, I forgive you. Oh boy. To understand the significance of this moment and Don's interpretation of the meadowlark's song, you need to know some of Don's story. Don's maternal grandparents moved to central Alberta in 1910, settling on land north and west of the town of Killam. Founded as a village in 1906, Killam sits on Treaty 6 land that was once home to 50 First Nations tribes, including Cree, Nakota, and Dene peoples. Like so many European immigrants, Don's grandparents had moved west in pursuit of opportunity and a good life. They built a barn in 1913 and then a house in 1960. That's important. The farm prospered. Some of the family stayed on to do the work. When Don and Marie purchased the farm from Don's uncle and aunt in 1983, much of it was in pristine condition. They delighted in the knowledge that they were building on a family history and commitment to this particular piece of land. But as Don recalls, they were excited to know that as owners, they could now realize their dream. During the 1980s, the push in agriculture from bankers, government officials, and agricultural experts was to industrialize production and maximize yield. Across the Canadian West, wetlands and sloughs were drained, bush and woodlots cut down, and native prairie plowed up, all so that as many acres as possible could be planted in grain. Don was not immune to the pressures most farmers felt. He grew grain and raised as many cattle as he could for the commodities markets. Every year, the pressure to increase yields in the face of dwindling profit margins mounted. To keep the farm going, loans to purchase ever bigger machinery, hybrid seeds, fertilizers, and herbicides had to increase at the same time. An enormous debt load accrued. The stress went straight into Don's body. In March 1986, he was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Personal illness was not allowed to stand in the way of meeting ever-increasing production quotas. The work simply had to continue, even accelerate. It was exhausting and enormously stressful. By the fall of 1995, the grain's harvest in, Don and Marie concluded that they had three options. 1, continue on this stressful journey of uncontrollable debt. 2, sell and move. Or 3, try another way of farming. The first option didn't look very promising, since continuing was quite literally destroying their lives and their land. The second option was attractive, because it represented a release from all the pressure. The third option was a bit unnerving. What would a different way of farming look like, and what would it require of them? When Don went to pick up the mail the next day, an answer was waiting in the form of a one-page flyer inviting them to attend an information meeting to learn about holistic farm management. Don went to the meeting and discovered that holistic management is about farming in ways that restore land to health, while also affording farmers and ranchers a sustainable way of life. Together, Don and Marie signed up for the 8-day course. In it, they learned about ecosystem services, the value of riparian zones and native species, the dangers of pesticides and herbicides, and the importance of plant and animal species diversity. They also began to understand their complicity in farming practices that were systematically degrading and destroying the land. A crucial insight was dawning in their minds. As farmers, they do not simply live on the land, but from it and through it as members of one vast community of life. The following spring, Don and Marie saw their farm with fresh eyes. They now understood that they were going to have to change their lives. The patterns of their daily work, the range of their affections and sympathies, the measurement of success and failure, and their idea of a good human life. All of these needed to change if they were going to farm in ways that heal and nurture the land. Change was not going to be easy. They would need to unlearn 12 years of industrial methods and resist the pressures of banks, neighbors to continue in well-established and officially sanctioned ways. The risk they were taking was enormous. How would they pay their bills? Would they still be accepted by their community? The farm, a family history, and inherited ways of knowing, feeling, and working, all were on the line. The following year, 1997, Don and Marie sold all their grain equipment and 320 acres of cultivated land. They converted the 600 remaining acres of cultivated land into pasture and planned to treat the 200 acres of native prairie, wetlands, and woods with newfound respect. A system of rotational grazing was put in place for the broilers, turkeys, laying hens, and hogs that were now to be the base of the farm operation. Cattle would be regularly moved through fenced-in paddocks in order not to overgraze pasture land or contaminate waterways flowing through their land. The goal forward was to restore the land to vitality and health by giving it regular times to rest and replenish. By May 1999, Don and Marie had paid down all their debt. As Don puts it, I am unable to clearly explain and do justice to how this removal of debt affected me. I felt as though I had been held hostage by the banking system, and now I was free. We could talk about debt more generally. It's a huge problem, people, about the question of hope even. The freedom Don now felt was wholly unlike the freedom he had felt upon first purchasing the farm. In 1983, it was a freedom to do with the land whatever he wanted, a freedom to work out his dreams of personal and family success by making the land produce. In 1999, however, it was a freedom to serve the land and to nurture it to health, a freedom to give himself to the land rather than to bankers in the work that facilitated multi-species flourishing. To realize this new form of freedom, Don knew he was going to need a lot of help. It came in the form of teachers, biologists, riparian and agroforestry specialists, ornithologists, entomologists, ecologists, and range and wetland specialists. They all gently and graciously offered their expertise. They helped him understand the damage that industrial methods had done to the land, and they showed him how to work with nature rather than against it. What followed was a complex, intensive management program that prioritized the protection of riparian zones the replanting of roughly 100,000 trees, the reintroduction of native grasses and pollinator-friendly plants, and the creation of habitat for diverse wildlife species. As Don and Marie eliminated the use of poisons, repaired their water systems, and restored native grasses, a hospitable habitat for microbes and insects, bees and butterflies, and birds and mammals, they began to come back. Along with the western meadowlark that sent Don to the ground, Swainson hawks, Sprague's pipits, pileated woodpeckers, kingfishers, beavers, badgers, deer, and moose, to name just a few, returned to the farm. As Don understands it, their return is their confirmation of his efforts to repair and restore the land that he had damaged. In their return, he feels the land's forgiveness and their willingness to live with him. Don's experience of feeling forgiven by the land was preceded by his commitment to seek forgiveness. At first, Don would not have expressed his commitment or his work in exactly these terms, since little in his church or cultural formation spoke of the need for such forgiveness. How does a person go about asking forgiveness from the land? Who exactly is being asked? Don didn't have clear answers to these questions. What he knew is that he needed to change his life and his ways of work if he wanted to live rightly on his farm. The years spent nurturing the land to health and restoring native species signaled his acknowledgement, what some might call his confession, that he had wronged the land and its creatures, and that he needed to apologize for and repent of the practices that had damaged both. To seek forgiveness is to commit to naming, facing, and correcting the errors of past behaviors. It is to want to mend broken relationships and thus open the possibility of a better future life with others. Now, I go into some more detail about Don's story because it doesn't end, obviously, with him. Because there's this whole question about, well, first of all, Don is on land that was owned by indigenous peoples for millennia. And so I then tell a bit of a story that happens a few years later when Pope Francis comes to central Alberta to seek forgiveness. And it's a beautiful story, and we can talk about some of that if you'd like. But what I do with Don's story, I also then do in another chapter talking about the need for forgiveness and the granting of forgiveness by developing some of the elements that happened in South Africa with the TRC. Some amazing stories come out of that period in South African history. And if we want, we can talk about some of that too in some time, but I want to keep on going. So forgiveness is going to be essential to living a hopeful life because there needs to be repentance and acknowledgement of the wrongs we have done, which means especially people like me who have a huge responsible for having participated and promoted systems of being in the world, economic systems, political systems, that are doing so much damage and therefore making the future look so much darker for younger people. Right? That's going to be an essential part of the work. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to bring people along into a better future. Because the thing that is so troubling to me is how so many people confuse hope and optimism. Right? Should you be optimistic? Oh, I'm optimistic. I'm just an optimistic person. Things are going to work out all right. We like to think this, but what we don't appreciate is how much that way of framing the future does not ever challenge the status quo. In fact, it doesn't even require us to examine the status quo. Because things, if you just let them go on, it'll be all right in the end. And young people don't believe that. They simply do not believe it's all going to work out in the end. Right? They're convinced it's going bad and it's going to get worse, which is why many of them are saying, we're not going to have children. They can't imagine. And I talk a little bit about this, about how there is a growing movement around the world in which young people are saying, we're done with having kids. Why would we want to bring children into a world like this? This is serious, deeply troubling, but also deeply honest. And we have to recognize how much weight people are feeling when they look into a future and see this is the danger that's looming. And it's not just looming for many people, right? This is the confusion that I think many of us live under when we live in sort of places of comfort. is that the dangers are being felt right now. And they're being experienced by people all around the world. And so how do you live into a world of darkness? And so I want to end with a section from a chapter called Erotic Hope. And I get this term erotic from Audre Lorde. And the reason I really love what Audre Lorde is doing is she's talking about how there is a kind of basic need within people to start with the ability to affirm themselves and their bodies. And she says that especially African American women have been taught, don't trust your body. Don't trust the well springs of feeling that are deep within you. And so I look a little bit about why I think love is absolutely essential to whatever way we talk about a hopeful future. Because when we live in contexts where people feel abandoned, where people feel abused, we need to be able to find the ways to, first of all, acknowledge the love-worthiness of their lives. Right? If we can't start there, because it has to begin with your body. If you don't feel at the core of your being that you are love-worthy, everything else becomes very, very difficult to move into. And I don't take for granted that people feel this. I know I have a colleague, she teaches ethics in the business school at Duke. And she, it's kind of a joke. Nobody actually cares about ethics at the business school. But they have to do this because it sort of looks good. But she meets with these students. They don't want to be there because they know they came to this school to learn how to make a lot of money. And so they resent, in a way, doing this class. And so she would start often by going through some ethical theories. Really boring. Nobody cared. And so every time she finished the class, she said, this is miserable. And then one day she said, I think I have to start a completely different way. And a lot of her students are international. They're in executive MBA programs. And so she said, I'm going to start with a question. She went to the students and said, okay, how many of you believe you are loved for being who you are? And what amazed her is students said, I've never been asked that question. Never. And she said, come on, your parents? They've never told you you're loved for who you are? And they said no. And she said, well, what does your life matter for then? And their answer was, well, it's to get ahead. Right? We come to America to get the degree so that we can have position when we go into our work worlds and have an edge on our peers. And so she said, I had to completely re-describe what business ethics was about. Because if the love isn't found here, it's really hard to find the love anywhere else. That's the central issue. And if you see the number of people, and I encounter this with students over and over and over again, how many of them, especially the ones that come to Duke, right? High achieving, right? 35,000 people apply for 1,500 spots. And those 35,000 have already self-selected to think I even have a shot. It is super competitive. So these are young people who from the earliest age have been taught to build a CV. So, my son, he was actually admitted to Duke, and he went to the visit in person day, and he met these other people who were going to be incoming students. He says, I can't hang with these people. Some of them, they've built hospitals in Rwanda when they're 16, that's the intensity of the pressure that these young people feel to be productive, to stand out. And they're all incredibly insecure. Because they don't think they matter deep down. Because the minute you fail, you're out of favor. And the number of people who've been taught growing up with their parents, I will love you if, right? If you get an A, if you look this way, if you score that provincial championship basketball shot like I almost did. Right? All those things, that's the conditionality of love. And so the unconditionality of love that you find in Scripture, right? Paul's description, right? Nothing can separate you from the love of God. Is super, super important. But what I wanted to do in this section on erotic hope is do something that I know biblical scholars are going to be unhappy with. Is I think Paul is talking about erotic hope. And I know this is hard because Christians have been taught for, years and years that, Paul only cares about agape, which he does, right? And he uses the word agape. But I want to argue that agape is founded on God's primordial erotic character. And by erotic, what we mean is not pornographic, right? Pornography is the exact opposite of eroticism. Because pornography is about objectifying another. But eroticism is about freeing another into the goodness of their life. And Paul's about that. And I go to 1 Corinthians and I talk a little bit about how in Paul's letters you get a description about how the most important thing for Paul is community. Absolutely. That's the most important thing. And what worries him so much is that people are not attending to each other. And the large point I also want to draw here is that Paul's way of speaking is difficult for us to digest because we're living in a context that's defined by neoliberalism. The idea that we're all individuals and we make voluntary decisions about who to join with, what to join with. And anytime we're successful, it's because of our virtue. Anytime we fail, it's because of our own vice. You are on your own. That whole way of thinking about a human life is unintelligible to Paul's conception. Because for Paul, you are an ecclesial being. You are never single or one. You only are what you are because of the people you are with. And so for Paul, the most important thing is mutual upbuilding. And so in 1 Corinthians 13, I know that's the passage you read in weddings and the sentimental, romantic, all that kind of stuff. Paul's been doing something incredibly radical. And to make sense of some of that, I tell another story. The challenges and possibilities of a genuinely communal and love-animated life became especially clear to me several years ago when Mark and his family moved to town. Mark had just joined the faculty at the college where I taught, and I was pleased to meet him. He also joined our church, and we were becoming friends. He played the banjo. We thought we might bluegrass band. His life, however, took an abrupt turn when his years-long nagging cough became so severe that he had difficulty crossing a room. He coughed up blood. His doctor soon gave him a lung cancer diagnosis and informed him that he had a short time to live. They told Mark that he should prepare his family for his death. The news was devastating. Having been in our community for only a few months, we all began to worry about how he and his family were going to endure the journey ahead. Who would help navigate all the doctor visits? Who would do the shopping, driving, cooking, and cleaning now that Mark was unable to? Who would stand alongside his wife and kids as they struggled to cope physically and emotionally with this situation? Who would stay with Mark while family members were at work or in school? Remarkably, many people pitched in to help. Some brought food. Some bought gift cards. Others volunteered to drop off and pick up the kids at school. Others drove Mark to an unending number of doctor visits. Some sat with Mark during the day so he would not have to be alone. People who barely knew Mark and his family now adopted them as if that family were their own. It was beautiful to see this congregation surround Mark and his family with their love, but it was also hard because we knew that our love was hardly perfect. We worried we might say or do something unhelpful, say something really stupid. It was easy to feel inconvenienced by and sometimes even resentful of the many needs presented to us. We knew we could be petty and selfish and thus hardly worthy of the call to minister to this family. Seeing Mark's family grieve and endure many ups and downs, watching a man slowly die, knowing that our efforts to help seemed insufficient, it was a lot to bear. Not long before his death, Mark stood before our congregation and read from a journal entry written several years before. He recorded that his life was a living hell. He was empty and anxious. He disliked everything about his life, his town, his house, and his former job. He described how terribly alone he felt. Getting up in the morning filled him with dread. He didn't feel his life mattered. He felt abandoned by God and became an atheist. It was painful to us to hear him describe himself as sullen, withdrawn, angry, and sad. Mark knew he needed help. Some of it came from a psychiatrist who helped him understand and treat his depression, but he also knew that he needed a new context and new work. That is why he placed so much hope in the new teaching position. We expected to hear that the cancer diagnosis destroyed his hope, but instead he said, oxygen tank tucked under one arm, that now was the best he had felt in years. Mark said he wanted to bear witness to a miracle made evident in his life. He was no longer anxious or lonely. He wasn't sullen or angry. Instead, he felt himself to be surrounded by 1,000 arms of love from people he hardly knew, yet who wanted the best for him and his family. This love inspired him to give himself to his family and friends in ways he had scarcely thought possible. He expressed his gratitude for the prayers, food, cards, and the assurances that he was not alone and that others would be there for his family when he was gone. Oh, shit. He said that the love he experienced over the last month allowed him to taste the joy of God's kingdom. As Mark sat down, many of us were weeping. We were deeply moved by his testimony to the transformative power of love. Mark taught us that when love is active, a person can move from feeling alone, worthless, and unforgiven to being a beloved spouse, father, and friend. He taught us that someone who is visibly dying and suffering can be a source of encouragement and hope to others. He taught us that an ugly cancer need not be an obstacle to living a life that is still beautiful and worthy of being cherished. Love is crucial to a hopeful life because love is the power that creates a welcoming and nurturing community in which people can dream, explore, and develop the potential that is uniquely theirs. Love is paramount because it inspires the braided dance in which people can feel themselves moving with each other into the fullness of their particular lives. As Paul says, and now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. Paul believes the call to love is ultimately a call to people to participate in the divine love that daily creates and sustains the universe and all of its life. In other words, the whole of reality functions best when it is animated by the sacred and divinely erotic power that nurtures and celebrates life. The sort of power that is evident in the striking profusion, vitality, and diversity of the life we perceive around us. Of course, the world is not without pain and loss, which is why it is all the more important for people to learn to be a nurturing and hospitable presence wherever they are. Even so, love is the action that creates the social and economic and architectural context in which life has the best chance to thrive. Without love, the world literally falls apart. Can this love be trusted? I go into a long description then about why maybe not, using James Baldwin. Paul thinks it can, because it is the form of love that created the universe, that daily nurtures and heals it, and that in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead proves itself to be more powerful than the violence and abuse we bring against it. Paul believes that the love of God made incarnate in the person of Jesus is the key that unlocks the meaning and purpose of life. He believes it is the inspiration and the power that animates authentic hope. I'll stop there. Now, do we have some time for...
Absolutely.
So we have some time, so... Right.
I'd love to hear more about John's reconciliation with the saints in his area.
Yeah. So as he was doing this work, he had become friends with indigenous elders in the area and brought them regularly to his place to ask them, what do you think I should do here? And they gave advice. And several years after the work, they came and they actually honored him and said, you have made our elders happy by what you have done with this land. I then go to another story about a family in Kansas called the Tanderups, who they had been farming there for a number of years, and nobody thought anything about indigenous peoples. There had been a tribe that had been living there. It was a smallish tribe, and they had been obviously relocated into a reserve. But they met up with descendants of the tribe when they were both protesting the Keystone Pipeline. And they got to see how there was this connection. They had ancestors who shared this land. And so the Tanderup family, they said, why don't you come to our farm, bring some of your people, we'll bring our neighbors, and let's set up a teepee and let's tell stories. So they did. And in the course of those stories, they learned all kinds of things about what happened about that place that they didn't know, the Tanderups. And the husband and wife, they said, we have to do something about this. And so they had asked the tribe elders who were there, what if we made land available for you to grow your sacred corn, which they had kept in a pouch for decades and had not been able to plant on this ancestral land. And they were very moved. They said, we'd like to do it. And so they planted an acre, and they had no idea was this going to work. And it germinated, and it grew. And they got so excited, Tanderups and this tribal leaders, that the Tanderups said, we are going to create a treaty with you, a new treaty. And they gave them some of the land back. That is now their land. And the Tanderups will tell you, it's this puny gesture, right? A few acres in the context of hundreds of thousands of acres that were taken away from indigenous tribes. But they said that what was the most important thing was sitting around in the wintertime in these teepees telling stories about what the land has meant to them and the need to heal, right? And so again, what the Tanderups do is they seek forgiveness from these tribal leaders for what they had done, their ancestors. It's a pretty powerful story.
I'm curious. The word play has been in my head the past 2 days. Hearing you guys talk about being grandparents and the chickens and playing with the grass, and it strikes me that the role of play has to play a role in hope. Have you considered that, or can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, play and humor. Right? I think I have a chapter on that's called Resonant Hope, which I'm kind of proud of, actually. Because resonance is absolutely the crucial thing in life. From our most basic physiological being all the way up through any of the cultural practices that we can excel at, the whole aim is resonance. To not just be in the presence of another, but to feel the presence of another as a transformative power in your life. And what I do is I start by talking about how technology, especially as it develops in the modern period, is all about control. And it's about creating a world in which there is no friction, a world in which the world appears to us on our own terms. And the problem with that whole approach is that the more you try to control the world, the more you lose it. And that's the fundamental contradiction that we haven't grasped. Capitalism perverts it by saying you'll be happy the more you can acquire the world. And we all know that that's a lie. It's not to say that things aren't great. I mean, I'm coveting that guitar over there. But if I had it, would I be supremely happy? Well, I'd be happy playing some tunes, but then what's the next guitar? I'm going to find that you've got something else downstairs, and you think, well, that one too, right? We know how easily we are fooled by the desire to acquire and control. Because resonance can't happen. And you know this because when you're in a relationship with somebody and you sense things aren't going well, and you say to your partner, hey, what's going on here? She says, well, I've been trying to control you. As soon as they say that to you, you're gone. Because you can't be in a relationship with someone who's trying to control you. So control is the enemy of a resonant life. But play and comedy are crucial to it. Because play and comedy are both ways that signal your desire to let go of your grasp, whether that's a comprehensive grasp or a physical grasp. Right? Play means giving yourself to. Comedy, humor, means laughing at yourself and the silliness of your own pretension. And so I often in class, humor is a big part of what I do because I tell students, Yeah, I've been doing theology and philosophy for a very long time, but I'm still changing my mind because I was an idiot 10 years ago thinking this.
Yeah.
And if we can't laugh at our own idiocy, we're in trouble. It means we want to hold tightly. And life can't move when life is held tightly. And so, yeah, play is really important, as is humor, because it signals a willingness not to take yourself so seriously, a willingness not to make yourself the center of it, and instead to give yourself and be surprised and be able to see how foolish you were to think that you had it all figured out. So, yeah, really important. That's it.
I don't know if I've got this all well formed, but it strikes me that, in telling the story of Don, that part of what is needed is an imagination for different types of economies.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm struggling with is how do we develop a biblical sense of imagination to understand the importance of these different types of economies? Because
Yeah.
Someone like Don, I'm going to guess that their farm wasn't that large to begin with.
About 1,000 acres.
Yeah, large maybe for some people's terms, but if I think of my
Yeah.
family in Alberta, that's small.
Yeah.
And the imagination to actually think biblically, I need to change my understanding of economy. How do we go about?
Yeah.
And I think of this as a practitioner of theology. How do I go about building that type of imagination?
So what's so fascinating about this story with Don is, first of all, he's Catholic. He had read Laudato Si. He tried to engage his parish around Laudato Si. No interest.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
So he learned not from his theological tradition. He learned from ecologists.
Mm-hmm.
He learned from indigenous people. They're the ones who helped him see another imagination is possible. Now, could he have done it with biblical resources? For sure, he could have. One of the things that I'm seeing again and again, and this is actually something that gets younger people jazzed in the classes I teach, is, when you read the people who are activists working in climate lines, right? They are the ones who are constantly using this phrase, impossible futures, right? We have to imagine impossible futures because they recognize that sort of the, what's the phrase, right? The tools that built the master's house are not going to dismantle it. So you need a completely different way, and they get excited about trying that imagination. What would that even look like? How would you enter into a different imaginative space? And I think what they get excited about is learning from people on the margins. Right? And this is the really great stuff, I think, is learning from people. COP is going to happen again this year. There'll be all those tens of thousands of people in the big convention hall, but the really cool stuff is what's on the streets. Mm-hmm. Because that's where you find the young people, that's where you find the indigenous people, that's where you find the community leaders who are saying it's precisely those power structures in there that are going to make it impossible to imagine a different future, because they need the terms of the future to be set by what's happening now.
Right.
Because they're invested in the now. So you need people who are not invested in the now, who can then say something different. And I think Scripture is just full of this, because Scripture tells so many, tales of resisting the empire, the Pharaoh, the what have you. Right? The prophets are full of the folk who are talking about, resist the people who want to build land against land, who want to monetize, who want to take advantage of the orphans and the widows. Right? They're giving us a different future, one that is inspired by God's love for this world and this life. So there's lots of ways that you can sort of tap into theological sources, but the more I sort of deal in this stuff, so many theologians, they're not even registering this.
Yeah, but I'm not worried about the theologians, because I agree with you
Good.
on all of this.
Just forget about them, I think.
But I agree with you in terms of what Scripture says and all of these types of things. But if I preach a sermon in the Christian Reformed Church in Tabor, Alberta, where I grew up, I'm going to be, laughed out of the place.
Oh, and
or they're
Don
going to say this is garbage.
Don was laughed at by his farmer neighbors.
Yep.
And I said, why? And they said, well, A, they don't want to work with animals. Because when you have animals, you can't go down to Florida for 2 months in the winter.
Mm.
And they don't want that. And he says, He faced a lot of opposition and ridicule from neighbors. And here's the thing, eventually some of them started to see his farm and they said, it's kind of beautiful. It's lush. There's diversity of life. And, I don't know who I was talking about this with, farmers occupy a really tough place. And so I'm very hesitant to ever vilify farmers because they're dealing with incredible pressures, economic pressures, about how to do their work. And unlike the pressures I face where I still get a paycheck, they have pressures where if they choose to go a different way, they could lose a lot, if not everything. So it's silly for me to sit around judging farmers. But a lot of farmers, if you get to a particular place where there's trust that's been built up, they will say, this is not farming. It's commodity production,
right,
for markets. And they know they're getting screwed because it's all the middle people along the way who are making the money and they're not. Subsidies, that messes a lot of things up too. But so it's a really difficult conversation to have, which is why when you have farmers who do something very different, they can be a demonstration to their neighbors about what's different possible to do. And will they do it? Who knows? But this, again, I think is where it's so important to have communities of people who come around the folks who want to move into what seems to be an impossible future and say, we will be with you so that if you falter or fail, we're not going to let you go under because we're going to cover you however we can. And how that looks will vary from place to place, community to community, because what's possible in different communities varies quite a lot, I think. Any other questions?